Hey, good evening, all, and at least it's good evening on the East Coast of the US, and welcome to Orlando.NET User Group. Orlando.NET User Group is also the organization that holds monthly .NET meetups and the annual Orlando Code Camp. And this is the set of people that usually are the main organizers, although we get plenty of volunteers. So thanks to everyone who helps make this happen. If you want to follow Orlando.NET user group or get involved, you can basically contact us at any of these venues. So, meetup.com is where we primarily host our monthly meetups. Twitter is where we post updates. And we also have a Facebook group. We had a Twitch channel, although we need to activate that. And we are on LinkedIn too. For upcoming meetings in March, I have Facundo Gana, and he is going to probably talk about Linux terminal for .NET developers. The date is to be decided, but I think we have kind of aligned on the topic. If you want to help support Orlando.NET user group and you are an organization, you can always sponsor us. And if you're an individual, you can chip in on our meetup page. So if you go to this link on the meetup page, you can help sponsor Orlando.NET user group. So just want to quickly peek in and see if anyone has any announcements, any kind of events or open source projects, anything cool anyone want to talk about?
The Orlando IoT meetup group is always looking for new speakers. So if you guys have any cool IoT projects or have interesting cross section between IoT and .NET, we'd love to talk to you about hosting the meetup.
Actually, LaBrina, don't you do some kind of IoT work also?
Yeah, I mean, it's more of hobby, but yeah, I do IoT stuff.
Most of us are hobbyists.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I may reach out after the meetup then.
Okay, cool.
And I think, we also have other speakers who may be interested in that. So Garrett, just hit me up after this and we'll talk.
I'd love to. Great.
So tonight's agenda, obviously, we are doing the welcome notes and announcements. Just know that this talk is being recorded and we will upload it to YouTube. And tonight's speaker is LaBrina, and she will be talking about .NET Microservices equals MegaFun. Now, I am really interested in, microservices and knowing how they are fun, because maybe LaBrina will convince me, because all right, so a little bit about LaBrina, and we will let her kind of introduce herself, but I want to give a quick intro. She's a senior software engineer at Microsoft with over 18 years in the .NET in our Microsoft stack. She's currently focused on helping startups and ISVs migrate to Azure and modernize their software as a solution for cloud. She works with them to leverage cutting-edge technology like AI, chatbots, IoT Edge. That's where I got it from LaBrina, by the way.
Yeah.
Serverless and DevOps. LaBrina is a speaker. She talks at conferences and user groups all over the world. And these days, I'm guessing mostly remote. And she also, I learned this recently, that she has a podcast called Disrupting the Cloud, although I have not seen episodes lately on there. So
I know we're refreshing. It's coming soon.
She highlights the journey of cloud newbies and professionals in cloud computing, especially women and Black, Indigenous, people of color. So with that, LaBrina, before you get started on the talk, why don't you tell us about, how you, kind of got started and how you ended up at Microsoft? And I'm sure that people are interested in knowing. So I'll kind of hand it off to you, and you can, take it from here. And then when you're ready to present, just share your screen.
Yeah. So just briefly, my journey, I've been working in tech, like you mentioned, for the past 18, now it's getting closer to 19 years. And I started out, I was lucky enough, like a lot of people starting out in the dot-com boom. So I kind of got a job as a consultant, and was working at Allstate. It's funny, one of my coworkers that worked on the same project like 18 years ago is working at Microsoft now, and we were like reminiscing about the project, like all that time ago, like all the long hours and craziness. And like my very first job, I was the original DevOps engineer. And I mean by that, like I did all the monitoring and support for our applications, only I didn't do it with that. There was no automation. So all of the fancy New Relic and all those fancy tools didn't exist by then. Like we were the automation. And I was actually mentioning this just earlier today, when we had a whole team of people and our job was literally just to hit the website every like half hour or something and check logs manually and all that stuff. And now it's like, all this modernization. And in fact, actually, I ended up automating myself out of that role because I was like, oh, this is stupid. Like, why are we all like running all these things manually? So I wrote a bunch of scripts and a lot of things to help automate some of the monitoring that we were doing. And they were like, this is great. We're going to build, Allstate was like, this is great. We're going to build like this whole team around it. And then I didn't do that role anymore, but I moved on to other stuff. And then I sort of got a chance I've always been in and around Microsoft technology. So I worked at Avanade for a really long time. Dave Cadrigal's in the building, so we worked together for a while. And then like I've been at Microsoft now for 5 years. I've had a couple of roles, but always focused on Azure and cloud and working with customers to help them move and kind of modernize on the cloud. So I am going to share my screen. Let me see.
Just a quick word. If anyone has any questions, just hit the raise hand button of Teams, and I'm monitoring the chat in here. So, or you can post it in chat. So either do one or the other, and I'll make sure your question gets on this. It gets on the call. So go ahead, LaBrina.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk a little bit about microservices and using them as a .NET developer. So I have to fully admit, being like the old person in the room, have been really late to the whole microservices, containers, all the rage thing. And it has been a slow journey for me. But luckily there's some interesting tools that are coming out for .NET developers to help some of that. And so that's sort of what we're going to talk about today. So I think we kind of covered a little bit about me, but yeah, I live in Washington, D.C. I've been doing stuff with Microsoft, doing Azure stuff. I've been married for 1.5 years now. I'm a dog mom. He's also my pair programmer, and he reviews all my PRs. So that's cool. And I'm a former world traveler. Hopefully I'll get to do it at some point again. But I've been to visited over like 39 countries. And it's a little bit of a bummer. I was supposed to actually almost write this, I think like in 2 weeks, I was actually supposed to be going on a trip to Antarctica, but unfortunately
Oh
that's
no.
not, yeah,
That's
unfortunately that's not a thing, but I'm here with you guys, so that's even better.
yeah,
So
you're in Florida, so
there you go. So for our agenda, I thought I would do just a quick kind of refresher on microservices, containers, and Kubernetes, just for those who are, if you're late to like me and to understanding these topics, then I'll just do a quick refresher. Then we're going to talk about some of the problems that .NET developers face, and actually all developers face with developing microservices and working with microservices locally on your machine. And then we're going to talk about some of those solutions with things like with a new tool that's out by Microsoft that's called Project Tye. We'll talk about some deployment options and just I'll answer Q&A. So before we really dive into it, I kind of want to just have a disclaimer that monoliths are awesome. So I know there's like always this huge like battle. I see it all the time on like Twitter and other places where there's like people are talking about monoliths. There are some really great monoliths out there, and they're amazing. And microservices really isn't for everyone. There's a lot of rigor and change. Like I work with, so it's interesting. I work with startups and I work with ISVs. So startups, they sort of were born in the cloud and they've always done microservices, and it's been a little, it's easy for them versus I've worked with some ISVs that have been around for a really, really long time, and they're trying to move to a microservice architecture, and it's quite difficult. I mean, it takes some time. So let's talk a little bit about what microservices are and why they're important. So microservices are really just independent API that they're really small. Just think of them as they handle a single unit of work. And so because they're these kind of independent APIs, they're very lightweight. They can be built independently, versioned independently, and deployed independently. So no longer do we have to, if there's a change that's needed, we don't have to wait and deploy this entire kind of monolithic application and have all the testing done for the entire monolith. We can actually choose any application. We can have development teams that are working independently and building software independently. So dev teams can then actually choose the right programming language for whatever the tool they're building, right? So I've been on a number of projects where some of the application is doing some machine learning work. And then we're doing some traditional, more kind of front end web application components. So the front end web application components, we're writing in C# and .NET, and then some of the machine learning and sort of data wrangling components, they're written in Python, and they all work perfectly together and super awesome. And because of that, you're able to get faster to market. So basically, we can iterate on something, build a small piece of code, deploy that without having to wait for the rest of the application to kind of catch up. So all the development teams, all the pieces of the application kind of work independently. So just I'm going to blow through some of this really quickly, but just so we're aware, so containers, right? So containers are kind of these lightweight bundles. So you have your microservice, you bundle it up in a container. It's very lightweight. It has everything that you need to run your app. It's immutable and it's optimized for fast deployment. So containers have isolations. meaning they can run alongside existing containers. So if you can imagine, as applications get larger and larger and more complex, there's all these containers that happen that your application has. And over time, there's all these other sort of other concerns that we have to deal with. So how do we manage secrets? How do we scale the solution up and down to manage different load? How do we do things like monitoring and health checks, managing all the resources, all the security, service discovery? There's a ton of things and ton of concerns that occur when we think about deploying microservices, which didn't necessarily occur when we were running monoliths, because it was one giant application that we deployed that had everything in it, and that was it. So it's sort of like one of those things where you get something and you lose kind of a lot. So Kubernetes is kind of the de facto orchestrator. I think a lot of us are definitely familiar with that. Allows you to really deploy. It comes with tons of plugins. The community is massive. I went to the Kubernetes conference, I think it was in November, and it was just massive. It was really awesome to see the community. And for me as a developer, that's actually one of the reasons why I started to feel more comfortable as a .NET developer trying to get into this whole containers, microservices, is really because similar to I used to do SharePoint a lot as well. I felt I never felt a community that was so embracing as since SharePoint. So Kubernetes has been really cool. That's why it's gained such popularity, and it's just the de facto. When containers kind of started, and there were a couple of different orchestrators out there like Docker Swarm and some other things, but Kubernetes kind of has sort of beat them all out over time. So let's talk a little bit about how Kubernetes works. So there is sort of two main clusters. And there's a master cluster that has kind of some of the main sort of cross-cutting things. So control manager, scheduler. Then you have your node cluster. So that's where all your microservices are going to get deployed. Then there's sort of, as users are connecting to your application, they're connecting to services, and there's the service discovery that goes on inside of Kubernetes. And then sort of at the bottom, there's what's called a registry, and that registry is used for deploying all of your containers. So that's where you can deploy, have a library of all of your containers, and they're all versioned. So that allows you to do a lot of things, things like blue-green deployment, rolling updates. All of those things are possible because we've got this kind of distributed system that's working together. So let's talk about just a couple of key Kubernetes terms. So at the lowest level is sort of a node. So it's which is really just a virtual machine. Well, it's not the lowest level, but it's a virtual machine with clusters and capable of running one or more pods. The lowest level is a pod, which is really just a group of tightly coupled containers that are managed over time. And then there's deployment, which is a kind of logical grouping or application for managing a set of pods. Then there's the service, which is basically the connection to the various pods. There's labels that contain kind of metadata for configuration, and then there's replica sets. Okay. So for a Kubernetes deployment, it all gets sort of defined in this YAML file. So this is sort of an example of a YAML file. I was just talking with somebody earlier, and you can think of a YAML file as kind of the old school as kind of an old school XML file. It's like the OG XML, or XML is the OG, and it was what it was. So so Kubernetes deployment, that basically there's a YAML file that gets created, and that's what's used by to actually deploy things into the cluster. Then there's kube control, which is really the command line tool for managing your Kubernetes clusters. And there's a whole plethora of tools that you can run on top of that. And we'll sort of talk about that in a little bit. So as a developer, as we get more microservices, as we get all of the, we get more distributed, there's as I mentioned before, there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of additional concerns, there's a lot of things that we have to think about. I mean, the basic thing of how do you actually run a microservice application locally and test it and do debugging across multiple projects, right? So, so all of those things. There's not a lot of, especially for .NET projects, there's not a lot of specific tooling for doing kind of local development for microservices. So we got a lot of flexibility, but yeah, a lot of problems. And then the other thing too is that there's a lot of tools that are out there. So there's Kubernetes, there's Docker, there's Helm, there's Istio. There's a ton. If you go out to the Cloud Native community website, there's a ton of projects that they have that they are incubating. Some are stable, and there's a lot out there. So the landscape is huge. And as a .NET developer, I mean, for me, it was definitely overwhelming. It's a lot to it's a lot to learn that's new. Whoops. So getting started today. So basically, if you're a .NET developer, some of the challenges that you're going to face are dealing with multiple projects and having to configure that. One of the bigger things is service discovery. So you've got all these services that are running independently. How do you discover those services? How do you configure ports for those services? And so generally, you'll probably have a lot of URLs everywhere that you have to now deal with and configure. And it just gets a little bit messy. And then also, in addition, how do you deal with additional kind of side effects or other dependencies? So Redis, so if you're using Redis cache or SQL or events or message or RabbitMQ or you name it, how do you deal with all of those dependencies together in a microservices type distributed environment? When we were working in a monolith, it was super, it's fun. Like everything's nicely packaged in a solution for us. We've got multiple projects, there's a nice solution and everything's good. But here, in a distributed environment, things get much, much more complicated. So some solutions, one of the solutions that you can use that sort of helps on some of this is using things like Docker Compose. So Docker Compose kind of helps with packaging up multiple containers. Sorry, one second. I should have turned off my some notifications I'm getting right now. Hold on one second. Yeah. So Docker Compose is a tool for defining and running multiple Docker container applications. With Compose, you just create a YAML file to configure all the application services, and then you use command line tools to create those services and configure and set up all the features in Compose. So that is one way to handle this a little bit, but it only partially solves it. And then this whole thing, there's a learning curve, as we kind of talked about again. And Docker's really heavy during development, and it still can make debugging really hard. As a .NET developer, I really just want to hit F5 or do some kind of run command and just start debugging and testing out my code. So I really want to focus on, again, get back to focusing on writing code and not sort of all the other tools and tools that you have to use for building microservices. So, we're going to now talk about, Project Tye. So Project Tye is a new experimental service that came out from Microsoft early last year. It's actually going to be, it's still in preview, but it's actually going to go GA and with the release of .NET 6 in November. So what Project Tye aims to do is really help developers go from instead of having to worry about all the different development tools and other things and all the other things you have to deal with distributed development, it sort of helps kind of eliminate that and streamline things. So everything's sort of all of that work is sort of done by the Project Tye tool, and then really you just have to handle running a couple command line statements to start debugging, to start testing, to see what's going on underneath the covers. You get a dashboard to run locally. It can actually build and Dockerize your services, and actually you can deploy your services to AKS. Actually, it's actually agnostic. I have AKS, Azure containers or Kubernetes service, but you can actually use it to deploy Kubernetes in general. So it can be used to do all those things. So to get started, you basically install the tool on your local machine. It works with .NET 5. The slide was a little bit old when .NET 5 was not yet released, but so it supports it supports obviously a couple older versions of .NET Core, and it works in .NET 5. You do need to have Docker Desktop installed before you use the Tye tool, and then also what it and then yeah, so you need the Docker Desktop tool, and you need to get kube control set up, which I'll show that in a little bit as well. Okay, so I'm going to do kind of a brief little demo of the Project Tye tool. Let me just get things set up here. So I'll show kind of a really kind of silly, stupid application, and then we'll kind of show some things that are a little bit more complex. All right, so here I've essentially got two projects running. So I've got a front end application and I've got a back end application. The front end application just sort of shows a couple of things, and the back end just the front end kind of shows some main things about the like IP address and things like that, and the backend kind of, and it calls into this backend service to retrieve that. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple, kind of boring application. Yeah. So the first thing that I want to actually kind of talk about is how Project Tye works. So, oops, I'm trying to like bring my tool over here. There you go. So when you first, so the first thing that you should do when you set up Project Tye is you can run a command that's called tye init. And what tye init does is it actually builds what's called a tye YAML file, and that tye YAML file will be the same file that you use that kind of defines the solution. So, and I'll show that in a minute, but the tye YAML file actually will, what Project Tye does is it actually uses service discovery. It actually uses kind of conventional mechanism to discover all the projects that are part of your deployment, and it will actually build those out for you and build out this YAML file based on that. So if I run tye init, and actually I have to do tye init --forth. All right, so what that actually has done, keep having to drag these over here. That's annoying. So what this actually has done is built a YAML file for me that sort of describes the services and everything. So it actually inspected inspected that folder, and it found these. It created a name, and it found these two services. So it found a service, and it gave it a name, back end, gave it the location, and then front end, and then gave it another and then gave it another name. Okay. So based on that, now we can actually do tye run. And what this is going to do is it's going to start inspecting that application, start looking at what's going on, and it's actually going to present to me a really nice dashboard that I can use to sort of inspect what's going on with my application. So you could see from here that it's built out a dashboard for me. It's built out some replicas, so it's built out my front end replica, it's built out my back end replica, and it's telling me it's listening for some processes. So I'm going to just go here and bring up the site. Okay, so in this dashboard now I have my services defined. I've got my back end and my front end services. It's actually set up some bindings for ports that I can connect to. I can actually view logs, and then I can actually connect to the services here. So it actually kind of gives me some more detailed information on metrics there, which those are actually evolving. And then it also, from a debugging perspective, it gives me additional details and logs that I can use for debugging my application. And so if I go here, I can just now quickly, yeah, I know. Yeah, so this is just, as I said, pretty boring application, but just kind of will illustrate showing like, okay, this is my backend, and now it's doing some port forwarding, and this is my front end, right? So pretty straightforward, pretty simple. So I could debug this application when I'm ready to go. I can actually straight from the command line deploy this application into a Kubernetes service, and I'll show that in a little bit. In addition to deploying it to a Kubernetes service, you can actually now, because it's a command line tool that you can interact with, because friends on that friends deploy straight from their dev machine, you could do things like integrating it with Azure DevOps or integrating it with like GitHub Actions as well. And there's some really cool articles on how to do that. So let's go here. Oops. So let's talk a little bit about how you would deploy. So there's a couple of steps. What I'm going to showcase is how to deploy this solution into Azure. But again, you could do similar steps to deploy it actually in any cloud. So the first thing that you want to do is actually create your container registry. And then after that, what you want to do is create an AKS cluster and make sure that that cluster is integrated with ATR. And then after that, you can use Tye deploy -- interactive. And interactive allows us to kind of get be able to interact with the deployment process. And then you'll actually see the deployment running in AKS. So let's go ahead and do. All right, so just like a cooking show, I have already deployed and set up. I've got my container registry out here, and I've got my AKS cluster. Oops. Hold on a second. So then the next thing what we're going to do is, very cool. Now what we're going to do, before we actually go ahead and deploy this just from our local machine, we're going to have to do a little bit of setup with installing a couple of additional components. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is actually install kubectl. So if you're not familiar with kubectl is the Kubernetes command line client. So I'm going to just do AZ, and I'm going to do AZ AKS install -CLI. So that's going to start getting, so that's going to download kubectl to my local machine and install it. So I've got that set up. The next thing that I want to do is actually configure kubectl to connect to my Kubernetes cluster. So when I run this command, it'll actually download my credentials and configure it to use the Kubernetes CLI. So I'm going to do AZ again, and AZ is just the Azure command line tool if you're not familiar with that. AZ AKS, and I'm going to run .get.credentials. And I'm going to specify the resource group that my AKS cluster is deployed to. If you're not familiar with what a resource group is, in Azure, it's just basically a logical grouping of all of your services that are deployed. So I've set up my resource group, and it's called Microservices demo-rg. And then the name of my cluster is Microservices AKS. Is that correct? Yeah. All right. So cool. And so now that's going to get my credentials. Oh, did I not name that right? See, live demos, live typing is hard. Here, we'll just copy it. So anyway, so as I don't know why this isn't deploying. That's weird. Not sure what's happening. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. We'll do this real quick. This is why you always just do sure. This is why you always redo this stuff. It's like super annoying. All right, so anyway, so that was done. And so what this did was just configure kube control. And so now just to test and make sure that I've successfully connected to my Kubernetes cluster, I'm just going to run kube control, get nodes. I should be able to now see. So I see the nodes running in my AKS cluster. Okay, so now what I want to do is now just log in to my container registry, and I just will use the AZACR command. So my name is all right, and what this is doing is it's going to get the speakers for me to log into my container registry, so we can see that's successful. So now that I've got that all stood up, I can now run Tye deploy -- interactive. And one thing that you could do is you could, which I have done before, is you could build like a little script or something to just get that done as part of your deployment. So now I'm actually going to deploy my Kubernetes, my solution out to my AKS cluster. So now I just have to give it my my ACR registry name, which is Microservices demo.azure ACR.io. All right, cool. And so now what it's going to be doing is it's going to be building, it's going to automatically build my Docker images. Oh, I always mistype that. Or let me go out. So now what it's going to do is, let me just make sure I just copy this right. It's just going to go and package up using Docker Compose. And just do that. All right. And it's going to push that project out to my AKS cluster. So build my Docker image. It's going to push that. It's created my Docker image. It's going to push that out to my container registry and just do all that work kind of for me. So A lot of the stuff you don't even actually need to know. And as I said, this could actually be part of your build or your deployment process with GitHub Actions. So now if I call it like queue control, git nodes, I can see that, and I can see my nodes running. I can call git pods. I can see, you can now see my back end and my front end got deployed. And I can call queue control git services. All right, so cool. So we actually now have our solution deployed and deployed to our AKS cluster. And I didn't have to do that. I didn't have to mess around with Docker. I didn't have to learn anything. I just had to run a couple of commands from command line tool. So the last thing that I want to do is actually be able to.
Question.
Oh, yeah.
The Tye, that particular tool, is it simply like, you install it using command line and then it only works on .NET solutions? Is that correct? Is it?
No, actually, it could work on any, inspect any kind of solutions. The only thing that you would have to do is it can inspect a lot of different files. So it doesn't necessarily have to be done.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so so now I just want to test. So my port. So I'll just check right now, do queue control get service backend. Oops, I did not type that. So this will actually just show me where my backend is running. So here's a cluster, here's the internal IP for that cluster, but I haven't actually set up an external IP. For things like that, you'd have to set up in like ingress control and everything, but there's actually a simple way that we can just test this out really quick. So we're gonna do something with queue control.
So there's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Garrett asks, do you need to install Kubernetes locally to use Tye?
No, you do not need to install Kubernetes locally, just the queue control CLI tool. So just you do need to have Docker installed and just just install the queue control CLI so that you can connect to the cluster wherever it is deployed. Queue control port. So I'm going to do port forward, and then I'm going to say service/backend, and basically what this says is, okay, I'm connected to this cluster. Any requests to my service to my backend service, please forward it to this port. So I'm going to just say forward to port 7000. Okay. Now what I should be able to do is connect, and we should see that same. We should see the same kind of backend service running as I did before. So I should now be able to go. Oops. Oh, cool. Yeah. And so now I just get this just returned kind of my IP, and it's returning the host name, and that was that same host name that we saw in our services or in our pods. So essentially what we just did was we basically had a .NET solution with a couple of microservices. We installed the Tye tool. We ran a couple of commands and deployed our application to Kubernetes without having to do any additional work, having to install Kubernetes locally, having to do anything like that. So really simple, sort of the tool sort of shields us from a lot of the additional work that we have to do. And you could do this same, run these same commands. There, as I said, there's some GitHub actions that support this work. So you could actually just think about your DevOps lifecycle. You could actually, as you're checking in code, that could actually trigger a build, and then that could actually trigger a deployment just using the Tye tool to deploy out to your AKS cluster. So much more simplified and compressed thing. Life set of tasks, a lot less that I had to learn. So it's sort of, I think using Project Tye has made it a lot more palatable for me to start learning, because without having to feel sort of overwhelmed with learning other things, with learning kind of the whole entire landscape of tools like Helm and Istio and all these kind of other tools that you have to learn for deploying microservice applications in Kubernetes.
There's another
Okay.
question in chat.
Yeah.
Garrett asks, are there Azure pipelines actions as well? Garrett, can you come off mute and explain that? I'm not sure what your question.
Yeah, sure. LaBrina mentioned GitHub actions, but if I'm using Azure pipelines for my DevOps, can I use Tye YAML file as well? Excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you can use either Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions. Either one will work to do this sort of same thing.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
So basically, as part of your, if I understand correctly, basically as part of your pipeline, you need to call the install Tye script, and then you can use it in the pipeline. Is that correct?
That is correct. So basically, when your pipeline is going to essentially run all those commands that I just painfully typed in the command line. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
So sometimes there's like those quick start actions that like do all the work for you. Do you know if there's any of those out there?
There is I believe there is a quick start action that the team, and I'm gonna do a quick cheat. If I look at it was either being worked on or I know it was being worked on. I wonder, is it under the samples? No, it's not there. But there is something somewhere that was being worked on for that. So yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right, so I'm just gonna kind of briefly give you a quick overview of a couple of one other sort of topic. It's a pretty big topic in Dapper, but I thought it's in sort of like learning and moving to do microservices. I think it's another good tool to learn how to do Dapper, or to learn how to do microservices. So similar to so while Project Tye kind of focuses on deployment and debugging and kind of the developer, like local developer experience, Dapper actually provides sort of a lot of building blocks as services that you can tie into to handle a lot of the sort of common things that you have to handle as a developer when you're building microservices. So Dapper kind of encompasses all these best practices for building applications into open and independent kind of building blocks. And they can support a bunch of different, any programming language, and then it's running your API. So it has all these building blocks like, handling service-to-service invocation or state management or pub sub, which for me, I'm a big event-driven, I'm a big fan of event-driven architectures. And so this one is one that I kind of use all the time. So bindings and triggers, actors, observability, secrets, and extensibility. And it allows you to deploy those components easily. And the way that it does it is it uses a pattern that's called sidecar. So you can imagine sidecar, the name sidecar pattern came from imagine the motorcycle with the sidecar. So the sidecar pattern is basically where you're able to run kind of two pods running together. So imagine your main service with your kind of business logic that's doing whatever that does, and then a sidecar that's sort of handling some of these other sort of separation and concerns. So it's sort of they're co-located together in a primary application, but they're placed in their own process or container. So you have kind of more of a homogeneous solution. And this just sort of kind of talks about just the building blocks in more detail. So essentially, you can sort of plug in, and you don't have to worry about having to write code for a lot of the routine tasks that you typically would use in microservices. So it's sort of encapsulating a lot of that. And if anyone's familiar with Akka.net and actors, this will be a really easy transition. It's sort of like if Akka.net with microservices had a baby, then Dapper would be born. So I'll just cover briefly, getting started with Dapper is actually pretty easy. It again is another CLI that you download, and you can go out to the dapr.io website and deploy it. You can install it, and then you just start using the Dapper API. So all those building blocks are exposed as APIs, and you just configure and you run it alongside as a sidecar. So just in terms of resources, I would say always start learning a little bit about Docker, learn a little bit about Docker Compose, then sort of jump into Project Tye, and I'll show the website in a little bit. If you're new to, I should have put something for learning Kubernetes. There's some really good Kubernetes in a month of lunches and containers in a month of lunches that are really good if you're new to Kubernetes or containers. That's a really good thing. It's actually something that I've done. And then for AKS and ACR, if you're new to that, and then Dapper as well. That's really all I got. I know you're asking questions as there were, but as they were coming, but are there any other questions? So.
Any questions, anyone? I mean, you can come off mute and ask if you have questions. I do have one.
Yeah.
Going back to microservices, so microservices, obviously, you mentioned that you can have different types of modules in different languages and frameworks and stuff. So, do you know of any best practices as far as handling the maturity levels of the code? Like some may be early stage prototype code or something, some may be brownfield code that's been around for a long time. So are there any known best practices for doing that, or are you aware of anything like that?
I think I'm not so aware, but I mean, I think that's the nice part of microservices is that those things can coexist. So and they don't necessarily have to be and they can coexist, right? So you might have some microservices or some parts of your application that are very, very mature. And let's say they only need to get deployed, like the release cycle is once every 4 months or 6 months or whatever. But you might have some newer parts of your solution where there's a lot more rapid prototyping and deployment, and they're getting updated a lot more often. And because everything's sort of working independently, it supports that model, right? So I can now introduce, I've got a couple of very, stable old solutions that microservices that have been deployed, and they are what they are. And then you can have some newer ones that they're rapidly updating and changing. And that's where things like strategies like blue-green deployments or like rolling deployments kind of come into play. So I think that's the nice part, is that you can support different parts of your solution, can be at like different maturity levels, and it all works. Any other questions?
I have one question. It's just kind of like generally when you have all these microservices, what's kind of your recommended way of just dealing with configuration? Like you have end up with a lot of shared configuration kind of keys. So what's a good way of just dealing with that?
Yeah, so essentially in Kubernetes, there's a way to, as part of your what's called a deployment, each individual deployment is where you would store configuration and keys and things like that. So again, you can, and if you're using something like Dapper, that can like run as like what we call a sidecar. So that actually becomes part of your sort of deployment for as a for handling all those secrets and things.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, so going back to monoliths and microservices, like what is like a scenario where, let's say that, someone wants to convert a monolith to microservices. What is a scenario where, they should absolutely not do that, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think it's sometimes more about the maturity level of the organization and sort of where they are, right? And are they ready to do that? I mean, that's something that I actually work with companies all the time with, which, are, because there's a lot more rigor and automation and DevOps. So I think it's not just about, oh, let's build some microservices, like let's build some microservices. There's also all the DevOps, all the GitOps, like in order to make this really work, you have to also really be focused on those pieces too. So I think gauging like an organization's kind of readiness to sort of take on that is pretty key. And there's a couple of patterns that I don't know if anyone's familiar with it. It has such a terrible name, that but it's called the Strangler Pattern, which is really weird. but it actually is a way to sort of grow your application over time and sort of slowly move instead of having to do, making your, sort of one or, all or nothing when it comes to monoliths versus microservices. It's a technique that's used to sort of slowly move an organization from monolith to microservices.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
LaBrina, this is Dave. Quick question.
Yes.
How does what I really struggle with this whole microservices thing is how do the database interactions work? So let's say like you have a really simple custom order management system, right? So your services are probably for customer, order, and let's just start with those two. So how do are you talking to like you're supposed to like a microservice is supposed to be all self-contained, and are you supposed to have like a customer database and an order database, and then how does like data transfer between the two, or like can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So this is sort of a classic question around sort of what it's a bit of a decision, right? So do you actually have a database for separate database for each microservice, or do you have kind of the shared database and maintain it, given that it's supposed to be kind of individually deployed? So I typically would say I'm sort of a fan of it sort of depends on the maturity. Again, I hate to use the maturity of the organization, but it sort of depends. So some organizations really will go to having a shared database, and I think from a complexity standpoint, that's fine, right? Because at the end of the day, these are just a set of APIs, right? So just imagine a set of APIs that are just doing a single task. And so the deployments do get a little bit, repeated, right? Because we're doing that, but I tend to find, I know like there's a lot of purists that feel like, oh, well, you should not have any dependencies. But I think that if you use techniques like sidecar patterns and things like that, I personally just think it makes more sense to do more of a shared database, unless you have to be a pretty sophisticated organization to really be able to handle and pull that off.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. No worries. Any other questions?
Yeah. So when you created, when you ran the Tye command, it seemed like it created a YAML file. Is there a specific like like structure to that, like a particular set of elements that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, so you can always, there is a schema for the YAML file. Let me see if I can find it. But yeah, so there's actually a schema. So that command line tool, it actually will inspect your solution and try to figure out like what should be in it. But and it will actually look at things like connection strings and other things. So if you have a connection string for SQL Server, or if you have a connection string for Redis Cache, it will actually pull that out. But you could also modify that, and just as long as you adhere to the schema. I was trying to find the Project Tye, the schema in the docs. Let me quickly get that. Here's our documentation. And yeah. So like this is just, and if you go out to the Project Tye site, you can get the schema. So this is just like how kind of the schema looks, and that's an example, but
So we don't have
yeah.
to simply go with the auto-generated one. We can create our own schema and
Yeah.
customize further.
Yeah, you can customize it and add whatever, because there could be cases where it's not there. For example, like if you need to define an ingress controller or some of these other things like RabbitMQ or something, you're gonna have to modify that YAML file. And so these kind of give you if you go out to the site, it gives you all the details on how to set that up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. One more Tye related question.
Yeah.
This is kind of newish, right? So do you know like if there are companies already using this as production workloads, or is it so new that it's still not?
Well, it's not. I think there are definitely some organizations that are using it more experimentally. I don't know that it's quite yet been deployed. It's still Project Tye itself is still kind of being deployed or developed. And as I said, it's actually not going to go GA until November. So I'm not familiar yet that there are tons of customers that are experimenting and playing with it, but not yet really using it for production workloads quite yet. But I think this is a good time to start getting involved with it before it goes GA.
Understood.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Hey, it's Garrett. You answered my questions earlier, so thanks for that. But I just wanted to say, as a monolith specialist, this is awesome. It's really cool to lower the barrier of entry to containers, and I really appreciate you sharing.
Yeah, no.
Experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad. I feel you. I totally feel you. Because yeah, like I said, I was super late. I was definitely the old lady sitting on the lawn telling the kids to get off her lawn when it came to containers and Kubernetes. But this definitely made it more palatable. And for me, like everyone learns things differently, but I learned sort of by seeing things happen, by seeing the tool build things for me. Then it was like, oh, I see what all's happening. And then that gave me a little bit more sort of firepower to go back and now start digging deeper into Kubernetes, because I was like, oh, okay, now I'm ready to understand like what a pod means and what a service means and all those things. Because now I sort of can see from the back end. It's sort of like reverse engineering, like when I don't know, like I typically like to like reverse engineer code to understand it. It's sort of that same approach.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
So what's sort of next for Tye? What does it still struggle with, and sort of what's the next horizon here?
Yeah, so I think I don't know who asked the question before about production ready, but there are still, I think, some things that in my mind like prevent it from being like completely production ready. Like some of the deployments don't yet, and I think it might have been released, don't yet support like when you deploy to Kubernetes SSL, which obviously is a problem when you're deploying services. I think it might have been fixed now, but that was like early on. That was like one of the things. The other thing, I don't know how many people do. So there's sort of two. So one of the other things is just sort of just maturing the overall like experience, right? Of streamlining the whole experience of deployment. I think it's done really well, but I think that could still be further refined. And I think the other thing I would say is just some of the support. So for serverless technologies too. So I'm also a big fan of like Azure Functions. And I actually sometimes cheat and don't necessarily, if I'm not doing like if I don't necessarily have to do a full blown, because there's different ways to deploy microservices. You don't necessarily have to always just deploy it inside of a Kubernetes cluster. One of the things that I actually do is deploy, if I don't have like a bunch of microservices that needs a lot of heavy orchestration, I'll deploy them to like an Azure. I'll deploy them all to like an Azure function, set of Azure functions. And sometimes that's actually cheaper. So there is a way to actually do it, but it's not fully deployed. It's not fully supported yet. So just it's got like a ton of promise, but yeah, it just needs like some polish. But I would definitely say if you're you know, like to be an open source contributor, this is actually a really good project. The team's like really cool. And you can actually go out and see like you know, open things and things that are ready for you to contribute to. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So you could actually see things. And there was a couple, oh yeah, see like, yeah. There's like, I like now, like as an open source contributor, like when people tag things as like the first issue. So yes, I encourage people, if you do like it and if you are playing with it, yeah, totally contribute to it. And any other questions?
I don't know if this term even makes sense here, but hot reload. Like, let's say I'm testing something is, I don't know. I guess I don't know where my question's going here, but
Does that support it?
yeah.
Yep, it actually is. I didn't demo it, but yeah, it actually supports hot reload. So yeah, you can, that's another like really cool thing. Like I didn't like fully show it, but you can just keep building.
That's awesome.
And yeah, so yeah, you can just keep making changes to your code, and it'll actually reload on the fly.
This is cool.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. So I'm glad. Well, thanks everyone. I think hopefully
Yeah.
I inspired a couple people.